Okay, thank you very much. Okay, if I just go to the beginning of this. Okay, so thank you very much. It's very nice to be here, and a privilege and honor to be here in this Architecture Week in Tampere. The point I'd like to raise, and the point that I've been asked to talk about, is this boundary between the public and private. And I'll just make an argument to say this is not a fixed and rigid boundary that we think of as permanent. And the reason I say that is because what we see is different changes in the boundaries between the public and the private. And I use the terms public and the private in broad sense. And what we see is, on the one hand, hardening of the boundaries in some senses, and softening of them in other senses, in institutional terms, in technological terms, but hardening in physical and physical expressions in architectural terms. So what my argument is that these boundaries are not rigid dividing lines between protected territories, but sites of interaction where new possibilities may be explored. At the same time, I will examine the limits of this porosity and flexibility in political and technological terms. I developed this argument in 3 stages. First, I examine the nature of these boundaries. Is that good enough? The nature of these boundaries and territories that they define, trying to outline 4 types of complexity. I want to show that territories on the 2 sides of the boundary are heterogeneous and interdependent. Then I look at the boundary from 2 perspectives, from either side. From the public sphere looking into the private, and one from the other side. To examine this boundary, how it is treated from each side. Finally, I come to my conclusion that the way we manage the boundary is a reflection of and a contributor to the degree of sophistication of a society. Basically, architecture and urbanism mostly are in the job of constructing or managing and articulating that boundary between the spheres. And the more articulate that boundary is treated, the more sophisticated a society becomes. So the nature of the boundaries and territories. We can see from these maps from cities long past that this is a very long-standing distinction between the public and private. We can recognize it in the oldest forms of cities. The boundary that separates them is the origin of the notion of law and the private property that are very much ingrained in society and are parts of the foundational aspects of modern society, any society. The control over a private and intimate space and the provision of spaces for public life are all integral part to social life. Our ability to decide what to reveal and what to conceal is an important part of our sense of well-being. The feeling of being exposed to unwanted gaze, of strangers interfering in our personal life, or of losing control over our homes are all unsettling and unwanted. At the same time, collective life needs collective spaces, and the idea of losing these collective spaces to private control is unwelcome. So the basic distinction between the public and private spheres is an essential part of social life. What I want to show, however, is the degree of complexity involved in this distinction. We can see the city as a multiplicity of distinctions. The public-private boundary is one of a series of distinctions that make up a city. In social studies, the city is regularly divided into social groups and classes with differences in age, gender, ethnicity, wealth, place of birth, citizenship, political affiliation, and voting patterns, and people map these. In planning and architecture, people have been talking about different functional land uses into buildings and landscapes, figure and ground. All of these are the way that cities are structured or analyzed. A morphological analysis, for example, may divide the city into topographical areas or different historical periods. Many more systems of classification we can remember that have been devised. Each of these systems of distinction can be and has been mapped to see where the boundaries are between the built and open space, between the medieval core and the modern expansion, between the areas where certain ethnic groups live, or between different neighborhoods of a city. These systems of distinction may be real or imagined, may be existing or invented or planned. What they all do is to add complexity to the way we can analyze the city. The public-private distinction is located within this complexity, and it is not standing alone. It is not detached from these multiple layers of natural, social, and historical complexity. The second complexity is the heterogeneity and porosity of these territories. When we think of the public, for example, we tend to think of the society as a whole. But society, as we see, is made of a lot of different groups. How do all these groups, who may have conflicting views and interests, make a single category of the public? Many critics, like feminist analysts, have argued that what is thought to be the public is really the sphere of men, which has historically excluded women. So there are many public spheres within what we generally think of as the public space. And there are boundaries between them, between these publics, visible or not. The same applies to the private sphere. The space of the home, which is the primary form of private space, is associated with a particular type of household. But now, with the continuing changes in the structure of the household, can we think of the private sphere in the same way? Also, the core of the private sphere is the individual human being. But the notion of an individual in control of their mental faculties and their actions is questioned by a whole range of disciplines, from philosophers to neuroscientists and psychologists, who refer to the complexities of the mind and how our thoughts are shaped by the public language that we use, by the subconscious part of our mind, and by the biological processes in the brain in its interaction with the body, none of which known to us. There are also the social theorists who say our social habits, are all socially constructed. And the political analysts who dispute the modern mythology of the omnipotent individual. What this all shows is how these territories are heterogeneous again, porous and socially constructed, rather than pure and homogeneous. The third complexity is that these systems of distinction are made by analysts and professionals, or shaped by social institutions that may or may not apply to everyone. This level of classification, therefore, takes a rather abstract character. While they may mean a lot to a planner or a designer, or a jurist, they may not mean much to an inhabitant of the city. These boundaries make up the city, dividing it into publicly accessible places and structured as spaces of possibility and limitations within it. So we are allowed, on the basis of this structuring, to go to places and prevent it from other places. It is a system of possibility and limitation, inclusion and exclusion. Overlaid on this structure of the city, and as an alternative to a structural bird's-eye view, there is a phenomenological sense of experiencing the city, as seen through the eyes of someone who lives there, who walks around, who experiences places from a personal life view. The bird's eye view maps the world and is interested to make clear distinctions on the map. Hence the subdivision of the world into neat categories. But if I look at the world from the first-person perspective, from the viewpoint of an I, or I as the first person, from the street eye level, I will see things completely differently, according to my experience, rather than strict categories that professionals and analysts have thought about. My clues about the spaces that I experience will come from subtle changes in color and texture, or from strong signs and physical barriers. My reading of the urban space from this perspective will be far more different than the view from above and on the map. The codes and conventions of the bird's eye view and street eye view, in other words, the third person and the first person view of the world, can be very different and are very different. And this is my fourth complexity, is the distinction, the realization that the public-private relations make a spectrum rather than a clear-cut boundary. The public and the private spheres are two social categories that are defined in relation to one another. They are two sides of the same coin. And they don't have a meaning without the other one. Most definitions of the public and private use the opposite term to define them. Public is what's not private, and vice versa. It's always interdependent. They are not independent categories, but bound together as opposites. But the reality of the urban environment is a lot more complex than a play of opposites. While there are places that we think of strictly private or strictly public, there are many areas that are somewhat ambiguous, in between places that we may not be sure if they are public or private. We are also aware of the danger of binary thinking, as it tends to give simplified normative values to complex situations, like the binaries of safe and unsafe, friends and enemies, good and evil, right and wrong. Whereas the reality is much gray, much more shaded. So the public-private distinctions are more along a spectrum rather than a clear-cut line. This makes the boundary far more ambiguous than we normally think. On a spectrum, where do we stop and say, this is private and no further, or vice versa? It is almost always clear in law on who the property belongs to, but the categories of use and the actual conditions on the ground become complex, multi-layered, and ambiguous, as is the case in these London squares, owned by privately owned but publicly used and considered to be beautiful public places. When we consider the four types of complexity that I mentioned, the multiple and overlapping systems of distinction, the heterogeneity and porosity of the territories and borders, the differences between abstract and experiential views of the city, and the spectrum of different levels of publicness and privacy, we see how these two spheres and the relations between them is far from clear in reality. This is where the act of boundary setting comes in. The role of the boundary is to define and delineate these various territories. Drawing a line is an exercise of power, as you all know. It creates a new reality and communicates it through a sign that is visible to others. It is at once a connection that links a series of points to each other, a barrier that separates one side from the other, but also the possibility of connecting its two sides through a bridge. It's an abstract expression of complex relations. In reverse, when the abstract line is given material dimensions, it transforms reality in many new ways. The question is, who is drawing that line? And on what basis? Such exertion of power includes some and excludes others. It generates winners and losers. So the question is how this boundary was set, by whom, for what, and on what basis. Sometimes a line is not authored by a single agent drawing a line, as designers think, but it shows the outcome of a struggle, an interaction, an agreement, and even conflict between two or more parties. It's the outcome of a process. But this line could also be a basis for peace, as when the borders are agreed upon, the warring parties can build peaceful relations. This is an old saying to say, bend your fences and have good links with your neighbor. The boundary settles the conflict, not always fairly, but can help maintain the social peace. It is the outcome of the battles for territoriality, but also the social collaboration to facilitate a peaceful coexistence. But when one side is fully excluded, as in this case on the streets of Los Angeles, and from any form of power to negotiate, they end up without a boundary, completely exposed, as they are the homeless. Now, I get to the second stage of my talk, and that's looking at the boundary from either side, from the public and from the private. This is a sketch on the wall of the Biennale of public space in Rome that I took a picture of. The first Biennale in public space, on public space, that was set up in Rome. And it shows the questioning why public space is so much smaller than the private. If we stand in the public space and think about caring for it, we see a number of threats from the private space encroaching onto it, resulting in the shrinkage of the public sphere. The medieval city, now this is a section of Prague, but you can take this from any city, was the place where the private interests competed against each other to use the limited space that was available within the walls of the city. This explains the picturesque character and the disordered way that space is organized, because it's an outcome of a continuous struggle for space where space is very limited. In our time, this concern has been revived. The changing relationship between the state, the market, and society has changed the processes of city building. These are two documents. One is the London Assembly produced this document to say how they are concerned about public life, which is controlled by private companies and organizations and individuals. And on the right, the Manifesto for Public Space that was published by the Mayor of London is also referring to the concern, despite his political status, which is not so very much in line with this way of thinking. The production and management of space is largely passed from the public sector to the private sector. It is a general process you see everywhere. And this is the scheme which is taking over a big chunk of Liverpool city centre by a private company, Grosvenor. And they've been given 250-year period to control this 42-acre site. And it's won a lot of design awards, and it's a very nice place to visit, but it's privatized a big chunk of the city center. So there's concern about the health of the public space and thereby the health of the society as a whole in the way that this passes, this changes. The close collaboration of the public and private sector organizations also has brought about concerns about the loss of public value at the expense of private gains. Public spaces are taken over by advertising and private functions. And this is what you see in Paris. And of course, this is the most exaggerated form of it that you can see, but there are all sorts of subtle forms of it that we see around us. And it becomes a site of attention. People talk about attention being the primary currency in economic terms. From the public squares, therefore, if you stand and look at the private sphere, you feel that the boundaries of the private space are constantly encroaching, reducing the size and significance of the public space. This is a major reason for the emergence of the debate about public space, and you hear a lot about that concern. There are, of course, other reasons for the interest in public space. Globalization and urbanization have demanded more attention to the city, because the city is where economic relations are founded, and increasingly so. The structural change in the urban economy, growth of services as the backbone of the city's economy, changing lifestyles that desires high-quality urban environments, the process of gentrification that displaces the lower-income groups and with higher-income ones, the quest for environmental sustainability that competes with suburbanization and therefore provides good asks for, if you look at European Environment Agency's documents, they ask for good quality urban spaces that enable people to have a choice. Rather than to go and live in the suburbs, they can live in good quality urban spaces. And that's one of the reasons for the emphasis on public space. Now, we go to the private sphere and look onto the public. Looking from the private sphere, there are similarly many concerns about the porosity of the boundaries, threats to privacy, and the shrinkage of the private space. This is particularly important in the digital world, where access to personal data by the governments and private companies has created continuous concern. The use of digital technology has led to a mediated lifestyle, which we all live, that seems to have abandoned the boundary between the public and the private. There are many efforts, and of course, the key here is whether I decide to open up the boundary and expose my data to others, or this happens without my consent. But there are a lot of things that happen without my consent anyway. There are many efforts to restore a protective boundary for the private space from the intrusion of others. Meanwhile, the dwindling qualities of public space and threats such as the fear of crime, in this case Johannesburg with electric fences and barbed wire and armed response threats, the fear of crime has led to a hardening of boundaries, particularly in the use of cameras, barbed wire, electric fences, and gated neighborhoods. In Johannesburg, you can apply to the city to gate a neighborhood you live in, put boundaries, create new boundaries, and block streets. So, the third now, we see from each side, when you look at it, there are threats, encroachments, and this is obviously ongoing forever, always been. The question is how we manage that. So this is my third and last section. What we see, therefore, is a hardening of physical boundaries and a softening of digital and institutional boundaries, all giving rise to anxiety about a healthy balance between the public and private spaces. It again shows that the public and private spheres are not homogeneous spheres, but multidimensional ones. It also shows that the main concern lies in the changing relations between the state and the market, the rise in social inequality in particular. The discussion of the boundaries cannot produce a single recipe for all circumstances. If the softening of the boundary between a house and a street may contribute to the quality of life in the city, and I'll come to that, the softening of the boundary between the public official and private interests in urban development projects, or between the state and the citizens in the use of digital technologies, may need close scrutiny, because we cannot talk about the public-private boundary in the same way in all spheres. There was a report by the British government to Lord Nolan, who wrote a report about the public-private relations in the conduct of the public officials. Of course, you don't expect them to mix public roles with private interests, and then therefore put the money in their pockets. Therefore, it's a question of keeping those boundaries clear and exposed to scrutiny. Same with digital porosity nowadays. And of course, there is this big concern These are two quotes from, three quotes perhaps, from three different documents, from OECD, from EU, and from UK National Equality Panel, that all talk about how there is a growing pattern of inequality in society, in all rich societies. And that creates the hardening of the boundaries, because when you have growing inequality, the two sides cannot work together, cannot live together. They feel they need to be protected from one another, or at least the rich think that they need to be protected from the poor. Now, but the interaction is a necessity. A basic question about the two spheres is, which comes first? Is the private sphere the basic unit of the city, and the public space is only connecting these parts, which is one way of looking at it? A city is made of lots of private spaces, and we only need streets to go through from one private space to another. Or is the public space the core of the city, and the private sphere is carved out of it? The ancient Greeks, in this case, you see in Athens, they distinguished a city from a human settlement by its public spaces and institutions. For them, a city was marked by these institutions, such as a theater, a marketplace, an assembly, whereas a settlement was just a collection of houses. For the 19th century reformers, the gathering of large numbers of people in cities created a large human settlement, gathering together alienated and uprooted individuals. These reformers developed major public institutions, such as public libraries. You see a big movement of creating public libraries, public parks, to create an integrated city out of a settlement. Without these public institutions of that century, cities could not continue like we know about them. The city, and more broadly, the human society, is a place of interaction. This is not to say that we are first individuals who decide whether or not to interact with others. But humans are social animals whose evolution has taken place in groups and societies. And therefore, from the start, the idea and the necessity of interaction is built into us. Indeed, the idea of individual is constructed as we are grown into adulthood and as we follow social conventions of independence and property ownership. So it is constructed in that sense. Interaction is by definition taking place at a meeting point. The boundaries that separate us to ensure a sense of privacy and comfort are also places of communication and sociability. The origin of the public space, as Leon Battista Alberti reminds us, is the crossroad. What he says there is a quote from his book, 500-600 years old. A forum is an enlarged crossroad, and a showground, which includes theater, circus, and gladiatorium, nothing but a forum surrounded with steps. Basically, a crossroad is at the heart of the city. But the crossroad is also the origin of human settlements, where the paths of different people meet. You can see the basis of many cities are crossroads. And where living together becomes possible. The boundary between the public and private spaces is an expression of status. This is the gate, they call it Filarete's gate. Filarete was, again, same age as Alberti, and he designed this gate for Duke of Milan's castle, of course, as an expression of his power. As Max Weber and Pierre Bourdieu thought, status is a major drive in society. Pierre Bourdieu uses status as the symbolic capital. Everything translates into symbolic capital for improving our position in society. But the boundary is also a site of recognition between different parties. A force that, since Hegel, has been recognized as a basis for social relations. This is a picture from Dublin, where a regeneration scheme on the left-hand side separates it, this wall in the middle separates it from the right hand, which is a poor neighborhood of the city. And the kids from the poor neighborhood were throwing stones, so they put that mesh on top of the wall. And the poor kids call this the Berlin Wall in Dublin. When the boundary between the public and private spaces becomes harsh and rigid, as this case shows, the city as a whole becomes harsh and unfriendly, as if the forces of recognition have departed. Some writers, like Jane Jacobs, have recommended a strict separation of public and private spaces. But this separation gives a harsh character to the city. This is the sort of sign you see a lot of the time in Los Angeles. This is from Los Angeles. But basically you're warned, it's a harsh character to be warned of armed response when you walk around the city. But wherever this boundary is soft and well articulated, we see a welcoming city, a far more sophisticated one. This is the Place de Vosges in Paris, this is a kind of spending effort, at least to articulate that boundary between the public and private in a welcoming way. Some of these sophistications are based on the possibility of safety, a degree of equality and relative social homogeneity. This is a picture from one of these new towns, garden cities outside London. I think it's Welling. And like in the suburbs, and this is a porch from an American suburb, it's based on the idea that you live in a place where there is a degree of social homogeneity. You are not exposed to people of all sorts of people from everywhere. So the porches and soft lawns separate the spheres, but openly and welcomingly. But what about the places where society is diverse, unequal, and unsafe? This is same architecture, but in South Africa, in Johannesburg. It used to be open and welcoming, but it is no longer. The main difference between the public and private spaces is access. How do we recognize a public space? Is access. It is this access which becomes more limited when, under the conditions of inequality and harsh boundaries, we lose that possibility of accessibility. Of course, it's not a question of access to everywhere at all times, under all conditions, but it's managing that access in a peaceful and friendly way. Most new housing developments in China, this is again from South Africa, most developments in China have been based on walled neighborhoods, where the boundary is sharp and the public space rather limited. This is a historic story, but also based on large sizes of immigration from rural areas to big cities. Most gated neighborhoods in the United States, Brazil, and South Africa are based on the fear of the other. These neighborhoods are places with controlled and rigid boundaries, reflecting the loss of hope in having an equal and peaceful society. So, the role of architecture in urbanism. Fighting inequality and insecurity is a big societal challenge. The role of architecture in urbanism can be taking refuge in the status quo, to say nothing we can do about it. Enhancing and recreating the harsh boundaries as a reflection of the existing problems. They can also make an effort to create boundaries around which social dialogue can be built. Now, I'm going to finish my talk by showing you two examples that I've recently walked around in Milan. Milan, northwest corner, was an industrial space which is being regenerated. This is a new town of 50, 60 years ago called QT8. It was developed by modernist visionaries of the time. It's garden city, Italian style, and it's old now, but it's kept its attractions. A lot of artists and intellectuals are now wanting to live in this area, despite being out of the way. But you see the distinction between the separation of the public and private here. They have boundaries, but they have very beautiful, mature spaces that you can go into as an outsider. I could walk around these places. There are lots of passages, lots of ways that you can explore the area. Of course, you cannot enter, and you should not be able to enter into some areas, and I wasn't expecting it, but this is the expectation, this is the experience you get from a space that was created long time ago, 2 generations ago perhaps, And it's kept its character, and it's a welcoming place. At least it's good quality environment. It's not the sort of Italian city type that you would imagine, because they explicitly said, we want to get rid of streets and squares and all that. So we may question their design assumptions, but I'm not getting into that discussion. What I want to show is the boundary between the public and private, how they manage that. And this is a new scheme. It's called City Life. It's designed by Zaha Hadid in a competition. It's a highly dense development, and the boundaries between this and the street are like, it's a fortress, basically. It's beautiful from some angles. It feels like a ship when you pass and you look at it. In many ways, it's a beautiful development. But the boundaries of this place, high density, upper class, expensive place, in an area which is highly unequal to it. And that's the cause of a lot of these boundaries going up, because of that social inequality, because the implantation of a new group into an area which is not fitting. You create boundaries, you create gates that are really not inviting you unless you have the code. And that's the condition. And this is the picture from this development. And now I look back to the other side of the road. And this is what you get is banal architecture, perhaps, but welcoming to a pedestrian who passes. Rather than, so you have two different experiences. If you are a stranger, if you're just passing through the street, on this side or on that side. Of course, I'm not saying that the greenery wouldn't mature on the other side, but the other side is not trying even to engage. And that is the problem of the boundary, which is hardening, and you have the choice, or you don't. Because in this case, in this competition, the winner was able to show how they can generate more value out of the land. So that was the primary condition, consideration, as well as, of course, the branding of the development by the famous architect. And thank you very much.